It was a quiet evening in the suburbs, the kind of peaceful night where the only sounds were crickets chirping and leaves rustling in the breeze. That calm was shattered by the sharp screech of tires, followed by the piercing flash of red and blue lights bouncing off the shiny black surface of a luxury car. David Carter, seated behind the wheel, felt his chest tighten. He eased his car to the side of the road, the rhythmic pulse of the siren sending a chill down his spine. Dressed in a tailored navy suit with a silver tie, David had just left a successful charity gala where he had been the keynote speaker. On the outside, he looked calm and collected. On the inside, unease churned in his stomach. In the rearview mirror, David caught sight of the approaching officer. His tall, broad frame moved with authority, but his expression was hard and unfriendly. This wasn't a simple routine stop, David could tell. The officer, who later identified himself as Officer Reed, tapped sharply on the window with his knuckle, his impatience evident. "Roll down your window," he ordered, his voice clipped and firm. David pressed the button to lower the window, his fingers steady despite the tension in the air. "Good evening, officer," he said politely. But there was no acknowledgement. Instead, Officer Reed's eyes scanned the interior of the car, lingering on David's designer suit and the luxury dashboard. "License and registration," he demanded brusquely, his tone lacking any courtesy. David complied, keeping his movements slow and deliberate. As he handed over the documents, the officer's gaze narrowed. "Nice car," Reed said, his voice dripping with sarcasm. "Bet you've got a great story about how you got it." David held his composure, his jaw tightening just slightly. He'd heard comments like this before, and he knew better than to react. But he couldn't shake the feeling that this wasn't going to be just another routine traffic stop. Before we dive into this powerful story, make sure to subscribe to our channel so you never miss more inspiring and thought-provoking videos like this one. Your support helps us share impactful stories that matter. Now, let's get started. David Carter was no ordinary man. At 38, he had built a career most could only dream of. A successful businessman and philanthropist, he had worked tirelessly to support causes close to his heart, from educational programs for underprivileged kids to housing projects for the homeless. His name was respected in boardrooms and neighborhoods alike. He wasn't just wealthy, he was admired. Yet, as he sat in his luxury car on that quiet suburban street, David felt the same familiar weight pressing on him. The weight of assumptions, the weight of prejudice. No matter his achievements or the respect he had earned, moments like this reminded him of a truth he could never escape. On the outside, David was the picture of composure. His suit was neatly pressed, his tie perfectly knotted, and his watch, a family heirloom, glinted under the soft glow of the dashboard. But beneath that calm exterior, frustration simmered. He had worked his entire life to defy stereotypes, yet here he was again, facing a man who had likely already judged him based on the color of his skin and the car he drove. Officer Reed, on the other hand, couldn't care less about who David Carter might be. To him, David was just another black man in an expensive car, a combination that, in Reed's mind, almost certainly spelled trouble. He didn't see the philanthropist who had changed countless lives or the businessman who had built his empire from the ground up. He only saw what he wanted to see. Someone who didn't belong in this neighborhood, in this car, at this time of night. Reed had been on the force for over a decade, and his career had been marked by a string of complaints, though none had ever stuck. He had a knack for using his badge as a tool for asserting power, especially over those he believed wouldn't fight back. As he stood outside David's car, his posture was stiff, his expression stern. He tapped the registration papers against his palm, his eyes darting between David's face and the sleek interior of the car. "You don't see cars like this around here too often," Reed said, his tone dripping with suspicion. "Especially not driven by someone like you." David's grip on the steering wheel tightened, but he didn't respond. He had been here before, too many times to count. He knew better than to take the bait. The street around them was eerily quiet, a sharp contrast to the tension hanging in the air. Rows of suburban houses stood in the dim glow of streetlights, their windows dark and curtains drawn. A gentle breeze rustled the leaves on the trees, but even that sound seemed muted, as if the neighborhood itself was holding its breath. For David, this street symbolized a world he had worked hard to navigate, a world of opportunity and success that came with its own set of challenges for someone like him. For Reed, the street was just another stretch of his patrol route, and David's presence here felt out of place. Reed took a step closer to the car, leaning down slightly to meet David's eyes. "Where are you coming from?" he asked, his tone sharp. David hesitated for a moment, carefully choosing his words. "I just left a charity event," he said, his voice steady but firm. Reed raised an eyebrow, clearly skeptical. "Charity event, huh? Must have been some event to let you drive a car like this." David felt a flash of anger, but swallowed it down. He had spent his life proving people like Reed wrong, but tonight he wasn't sure it would matter. The street remained still and quiet, but the tension between the two men was palpable, filling the empty space around them. Reed, with his assumptions and authority, and David, with his calm resolve, were locked in a silent battle that neither of them had chosen, but both were forced to fight. Reed flipped through it, his expression darkening. "Why are you carrying a passport? Planning to skip town or something?" David clenched his jaw, forcing himself to remain calm. "I have an international flight in the morning. I keep it with me to avoid forgetting it." Reed scoffed, holding the passport up for the crowd to see. "Look at this, a passport. What kind of guy carries a passport around unless he's up to no good?" A murmur ran through the crowd, but David didn't react. He simply stood there, his gaze steady, refusing to be intimidated. Reed's smirk widened as he tossed the passport onto the ground. "Oops," he said mockingly. "Guess I dropped it." The act was deliberate, an unmistakable display of disrespect. David stared at the passport lying on the asphalt, his fists clenching at his sides. For a moment, the tension was so thick it felt like the air itself had frozen. But David didn't move. He didn't retaliate. Instead, he bent down slowly, picking up the passport and brushing it off. His every movement was measured, deliberate, and controlled. Reed watched him with a smug expression, clearly enjoying the power dynamic. "You think you're smart, don't you?" he sneered. "Well, I've got news for you. Guys like you always slip up eventually." David didn't respond. He simply returned to the driver's side of his car, leaning against the open door and staring at Reed. His calmness, his refusal to be provoked, seemed to unsettle the officer. The crowd, now larger, was watching intently. The atmosphere was thick with tension, and it was clear that this interaction was far from over. David's grip on the passport tightened as he extended it toward Officer Reed. "Here's my passport, officer," he said calmly. Reed snatched it from his hand, flipping it open with exaggerated impatience. His eyes scanned the pages, and an incredulous smirk spread across his face. A passport, huh? What, are you trying to impress me with this? This doesn't mean a thing, Reed scoffed. David stood silently, his face composed, though he could feel the growing weight of humiliation pressing on him. Reed's words weren't meant to question, they were meant to degrade. With a sudden flick of his wrist, Reed tossed the passport onto the ground. It landed face down on the asphalt, a stark symbol of the disrespect Reed clearly felt entitled to show. "Looks fake to me," Reed said, shrugging nonchalantly. The small crowd that had gathered gasped audibly, their murmurs rippling through the quiet street. The people, watching from the sidewalk, shifted uncomfortably, their phones still pointed toward the scene. David's eyes followed his passport as it fell, and for a brief moment he allowed himself to feel the frustration that burned within him. He clenched his fists at his sides, resisting the urge to react. He knew better than anyone that reacting in anger would only give Reed what he wanted, an excuse to escalate the situation even further. Calmly, David bent down to pick up the passport. He dusted it off with careful precision, his movements deliberate and unhurried. The crowd watched in silence, their collective discomfort palpable. Reed sneered, his posture relaxed as if he were enjoying a private show. "What's the matter? No snappy comeback this time," he taunted. David straightened up, meeting Reed's gaze without flinching. His voice was steady and firm as he replied, "I don't need to prove anything to you, officer. This is my documentation. Whether or not you choose to respect it says more about you than it does about me." The crowd murmured again, their respect for David's composure evident. Reed, however, was unmoved. If anything, his irritation deepened. "Oh, you've got an answer for everything, don't you?" Reed said, taking a step closer. David's calm demeanor only seemed to fuel Reed's hostility. The officer leaned in, his voice dropping to a low, menacing tone. "Listen here, Mr. Carter. Guys like you think you can talk your way out of anything. But let me tell you something. You're not as special as you think." The words hung in the air, heavy with implication. David didn't respond. He didn't need to. His silence was louder than anything he could have said. Reed's eyes flicked toward the crowd, realizing that more people were watching now. A woman in the front held her phone steady, recording every word and movement. For a split second, an uneasy flicker crossed Reed's face, but it was gone just as quickly as it had appeared. "Move along, folks," Reed barked at the onlookers. "Nothing to see here." But no one moved. The tension between Reed and David had captured their attention, and no one seemed willing to look away. David could feel the crowd's support in their silent presence. It gave him strength, reminding him that he wasn't alone in this moment. Reed, meanwhile, seemed to double down on his attempts to assert control. "Hand over your phone," he demanded, pointing at David. David raised an eyebrow. "On what grounds, officer?" "Obstruction," Reed said flatly. "You're interfering with an investigation." David's lips pressed into a thin line. He knew his rights, and he knew that Reed's demand was baseless. Still, he didn't want to escalate the situation further. Instead, he calmly replied, "I'm not interfering with anything. This is my personal property, and I have the right to record this interaction." Reed's face flushed with anger, his hand twitching near his holster. "Are you refusing to cooperate?" David remained still, his voice unwavering. "I'm fully cooperating, but I won't surrender my rights." The crowd murmured louder now, their frustration with Reed's behavior clear. Someone shouted from the back, "Leave him alone. He hasn't done anything wrong." Reed's jaw tightened as he glanced back at the crowd. His authority was slipping, and he knew it. Yet, rather than back down, he seemed determined to assert his power. "You think you're untouchable, don't you?" Reed hissed. "Well, let me tell you something. You're going to regret this." David didn't reply. He simply stood tall, his calm presence a stark contrast to Reed's seething frustration. The crowd's phones stayed fixed on the scene, ensuring that every word, every gesture would be documented and shared. Despite the humiliation, despite the officer's attempts to provoke him, David refused to lose his composure. He understood the stakes all too well. One wrong move could change everything, and he wasn't about to give Reed that satisfaction. As the tension in the air grew heavier, an unexpected voice broke through the murmurs of the crowd. "Wait a second. Isn't that David Carter?" A middle-aged man standing near the edge of the crowd exclaimed. Heads turned toward the man, his finger pointed directly at David. "Yeah, that's him. He's the CEO of Carter Industries. He's all over the news for the charity work he's been doing." A wave of recognition rippled through the onlookers. Several people began whispering, their eyes widening as they put the pieces together. A woman in the front stepped closer, holding up her phone as she recorded. "Oh my God, it is him. He's the guy who built that housing project downtown." David glanced at the man, giving him a brief nod of acknowledgement, though his expression remained composed. Inside, he felt a mix of relief and frustration. He had worked hard to be recognized for his achievements, but moments like these made it clear that, to some, it wasn't enough to overcome their biases. Officer Reed's face, on the other hand, went pale. His arrogant smirk vanished, replaced by a look of uncertainty. "Carter Industries?" he muttered under his breath, as if trying to process the information. David decided it was time to take control. Turning to face Reed, he spoke calmly but firmly. "Yes, officer, my name is David Carter. I'm the founder and CEO of Carter Industries. We've worked on dozens of community development projects across the state. Perhaps you've heard of the Carter Scholarship Program or the Carter Housing Initiative?" Reed's eyes darted around, suddenly aware that the crowd's attention was no longer on David's actions but his own. His posture shifted, the bravado draining from his stance. "Look, I was just doing my job," Reed stammered, trying to regain his composure. "It's nothing personal." David raised an eyebrow, his calm demeanor unwavering. "Nothing personal? You threw my passport on the ground. You accused me of crimes without any evidence, and now you're trying to justify your actions because you've realized who I am." The crowd, emboldened by David's words, murmured in agreement. Someone called out, "Yeah, explain yourself, officer." Reed's panic became more evident as the weight of the situation began to sink in. The crowd's phones were still recording, their cameras capturing every second of his discomfort. David took a step closer, his voice steady and measured. "Do you understand the implications of what you've done here tonight, Officer Reed? Not just to me, but to the uniform you wear, the badge you represent? I've spent my career building programs to bridge gaps and provide opportunities for people in underserved communities. And now, here you are, treating me like a criminal for no reason other than the color of my skin and the car I drive." Reed's mouth opened, but no words came out. The tables had turned completely, and he knew it. David continued, his tone calm but unyielding. "You should also know that I serve on the advisory board for the state's Department of Public Safety. I work closely with law enforcement agencies to ensure accountability and fairness in policing. So yes, Officer Reed, I understand exactly what's happening here tonight, and I intend to make sure that others do too." The crowd erupted into murmurs of approval. The mention of David's position on the advisory board clearly rattled Reed, who took a step back, his face flushed with a mix of fear and embarrassment. I didn't mean any disrespect," Reed stammered, his earlier bravado completely gone. "This was just a misunderstanding." David tilted his head slightly, his expression cool. "A misunderstanding? Let me ask you this, officer. If I wasn't David Carter, if I wasn't a CEO or a public figure, would this still be a misunderstanding? Or would it be something worse?" Reed had no answer. His silence spoke volumes, and the crowd didn't miss it. David straightened his posture, addressing both Reed and the onlookers. "This isn't just about me. This is about how people are treated based on assumptions and stereotypes. It's about accountability and ensuring that officers like you, those who abuse their power, are held responsible." Reed's hands fidgeted nervously at his sides. "Look, Mr. Carter, But David cut him off. "Save it," he said, his voice sharp. "The damage is done. Now, I suggest you call your supervisor and let them know what's happened here." Reed hesitated, clearly reluctant, but under the watchful eyes of the crowd he had little choice. He reached for his radio, his voice shaken slightly as he called for a superior to come to the scene. The atmosphere shifted. The once confident officer now seemed small and powerless, while David stood tall, his presence commanding and dignified. As Reed waited for his supervisor, David turned to the crowd. "Thank you all for being here," he said, his tone warm and genuine. "It's because of people like you that moments like this are documented, that accountability is possible. Please continue to use your voices and your platforms to stand against injustice." The crowd responded with a round of applause, their admiration for David clear. Minutes later, a police supervisor arrived at the scene. David calmly explained the situation, his voice steady as he recounted every detail. The supervisor's face grew grim as he listened, and it was clear that Reed would face consequences for his actions. As the situation was brought under control, David looked back at the crowd one last time. "Remember," he said, "change doesn't happen overnight, but every voice, every action brings us closer to a better world." With that, he returned to his car, his passport safely tucked back in his pocket. He drove away, knowing that he hadn't just stood up for himself. He had sent a powerful message about dignity, respect, and the importance of standing against prejudice. 6. Resolution, justice, and accountability. David leaned against his car, his phone still recording as Officer Reed's supervisor, Captain Harris, stepped out of a patrol SUV. The older man, dressed neatly in his uniform, approached with a look of concern, glancing at the crowd before turning his attention to David. "Mr. Carter," Captain Harris said, extending a hand. "I've heard about you and your contributions to the community. I'm sorry you've had to go through this. Please, tell me what happened." David shook his hand but maintained his calm demeanor. "Captain Harris, I appreciate your willingness to listen. I'll provide the full details." David recounted the events of the evening with precision, his tone steady and professional. He explained how Reed had pulled him over without probable cause, escalated the situation, thrown his passport on the ground, and acted with blatant disrespect and prejudice. Throughout his account, Captain Harris nodded solemnly, occasionally glancing at Reed, who stood rigidly to the side, his face pale and nervous. When David finished, Captain Harris turned to Reed, his expression stern. "Is this accurate?" he asked, his voice sharp. Reed hesitated, his gaze darting between David, the crowd, and his superior. I may have made some mistakes," he admitted, his voice barely above a whisper. "But I didn't mean for it to—" Captain Harris cut him off. "Officer Reed, your behavior is unacceptable. You've embarrassed yourself, this department, and the badge you wear. I'll be filing a full report, and you'll be placed under review effective immediately. Turn in your badge and weapon." Reed's mouth opened as if to protest, but the weight of the crowd's stares silenced him. Reluctantly, he removed his badge and gun, handing them over to Harris. The crowd murmured in approval, their phones still recording as Reed's humiliation unfolded. Reed turned to David, his voice trembling. I'm sorry, Mr. Carter. I wasn't thinking." David met his gaze, his expression unreadable. "An apology doesn't undo the harm you've caused. I hope you take this opportunity to reflect and do better in the future." His tone was cool but professional, carrying the authority of someone who knew his worth. As Reed was escorted away, Captain Harris turned back to David. "Thank you for handling this with grace, Mr. Carter. We'll make sure justice is served." David nodded. "Thank you, Captain. I trust you'll do what's necessary." With that, David got into his car, the crowd applauding as he drove away. He left with his dignity intact, knowing he had not only stood up for himself, but had sent a powerful message about accountability and justice. As David drove through the quiet streets, the tension of the evening slowly began to lift. The familiar hum of the engine and the soft rhythm of the tires on the pavement provided a moment of solace. Yet, his mind remained heavy with thoughts of what had just unfolded. This wasn't the first time he had faced prejudice, and he knew it wouldn't be the last. Despite all his success, his hard work, and his reputation, there were still those who couldn't see beyond the color of his skin. But tonight, he had stood his ground, not with anger, but with dignity and truth. David glanced at his passport resting on the passenger seat, a symbol of his identity and all he had achieved. He thought of the people in the crowd, their phones capturing everything. They had played a role in holding Officer Reed accountable, proven that collective voices could bring about change. As the streetlights passed overhead, David reflected on the deeper meaning of the night's events. Racism persisted, but so did resilience. Every stand against injustice, no matter how small, was a step forward. He whispered to himself, "What if we all did our part?" To the audience, the question lingered. How will you stand against injustice in your own life? This story isn't just about one man's experience. It's a reminder that standing up against injustice starts with each of us. How can you challenge discrimination in your own life? Share this story to inspire others, reflect on your role in creating change, and let's work together to build a fairer world.